adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the United States. We have Andrew Caruana Galizia, head of Europe and Eurasia World Economic Forum, Switzerland. Welcome. We have Vaniru Mwenene, senior advisor, market development and partnership in Supply Health Kenya. Welcome. We have Srinath Kondapalli, author, commentator, professor of Chinese Studies, Jawaharlal University, India. And of course, that's the panel with us. So ma'am, you can take over from here. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to this panel, which promises to be interesting. Everyone's agitated because. So there is this Simon and Garfunkel song. I don't know how many of you know Simon and Garfunkel. That's my vintage. And that song, it's called Sound of Silence. And in that song, they say, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening. And I was wondering that if that's what's happening in the democracies now, because this year we had 64 countries voting, 49% of the world, and yet democracy is not well, it's a bit unhealthy. And so is the multilateral system broken? Yes, it is. The UN is not responding to people. Neither is the WTO, because it's going towards a system that nobody understands. And what is the role of small and medium democracies to change or try and come in with a new language or a new mantra? Do they want to belong to the old system that is broken, or do they want to come in with a new way of thinking? Sir, you said something very nice recently, and I found it very beautiful. You said that peace is a political belief. And I have never heard it said like that. So could you speak to that, please?
Thank you very much. I do believe that what I did say should be first of all implied to democracies, because democracies are the ones who know the importance of peace, and they know how to operate, or otherwise they don't know how to operate in other circumstances, and that's why this is also very difficult for small and medium democracies to operate today. And when we say is a political belief, this is a political belief for several reasons and for several dimensions. It comes to social issues, to cultural issues, to economic issues, which are very important as well. But given the fact that what I told was in a different context, I would like to add to this, saying that peace is not only a political belief, but sometimes and nowadays it's also a political courage. And to have a political courage to promote for peace, especially it requires a strong democratic system, because nowadays, let's be frank, peace is not popular because there are big actors who are not the ones who are promoting the peace, but challenging it every day and trying to make us think that democracy is a threat for peace. And being a one to promote peace, you need to have a very difficult dialogue, not only with your international partners, but also within your society. And this is what Armenia preaches, and this is what we are trying to do. And probably many of you were at the opening ceremony yesterday, seeing how Prime Minister of Armenia gave a brilliant example showing the political courage that Armenia has to establish peace and stability in our region.
Yeah, I just did that, yeah. So the European Union's biggest success is the common market. It's an evolving concept, European Union itself, peace. Is Europe peaceful?
If Europe is peaceful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Europe is not peaceful at the moment, but it's an important question. What exactly is European Union? And you said it's idea of a common market idea of member states trading among each other, removing the barriers and so on. But the core idea of European Union is peace, is democracy. So after the Second World War, basically France and Germany at that time, but also other countries, got together in order to make sure the World War III does not happen. And the European integration that started shortly after the Second World War brought a peace to the continent, but among the member states. So there was no armed conflict between any member state of any European integration in the last 70 years. Which means European Union is, I would even argue, the most successful peace process or peace project in human history. For 70 years in a continent that was relatively violent in history, there was no armed conflict between the member states. Now the question is if Europe is a peaceful continent now, and we know it's not. So that's why I would argue that it's our obligation of current EU member states to argue for Europe as such to be connected as European Union is and prevent armed conflict among also those countries that are not in the European Union yet.
Have the courage to be peaceful, because peace needs courage as well. Andrew, I have a question for you. Just full transparency here, Andrew and I are friends, so you people need to know that. Andrew, are democracies and human rights, is a democracy the best protector of human rights?
That's a really big question, Chitra. So obviously, you cannot have human rights without democracy. But democracy is no guarantor of human rights by itself. I mean, democracy can descend into majoritarian rule. Mm-hmm. We often forget that there are many components of democracy. There's the rule of law, there's freedom of the press. And actually, without any of those elements, if you're missing a single one of those elements, then human rights are not protected and cannot be protected. And so, I mean, how to link this question back to the theme? I mean, one of the thinking about sort of why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about medium-sized and small democracies getting together and helping each other? Obviously, the main reason is the breakdown in the international order. We have multipolarity without multilateralism. There's no governance response to the chaos that we're seeing in the world, which means that obviously, if you're a small democratic state like Armenia, for example, you need to look around you for friends. You can't rely on the multilateral system or what's left of it. And why are democracies better allies than autocracies? For me, the answer is obvious. It's that democracies are accountable to their people, which means that their behavior internationally is under the control of their people. Whereas an autocracy can behave in an undemocratic, unreliable way internationally. There is nothing holding an autocracy in check domestically. The only check on an autocracy is external, and it's normally military force. So democracies don't go to war with each other, as the State Secretary said, mainly because people do not want to go to war with each other, and democratic governments are accountable to them. Now, Chitra, you mentioned we're friends, so I know you're also, actually as many Indians are, you're a bit skeptical about the European Union. The news in India is always very negative about the European Union. If you read the Indian news, you'd believe that the EU should have collapsed about 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
But I live in Europe. I
know. But, and obviously, you're right to be skeptical because the EU is an unfinished project. The EU depends on national governments being democratic. As soon as you have democratic backsliding in a national government within the EU, the European Union, so the European Commission, can do very little about it. with Hungary, we've seen threats to withhold funds. But as soon as the European Union member states wanted to send European aid to Ukraine, they had to compromise with Hungary. So those funds were unlocked. So actually the European project is only as strong, is only as democratic as its member states. We can go into a lot of detail about what needs to change,
sure.
but
the question was about normative standards of democracy. Are they different for small and medium as opposed to the large ones? And my submission would be you can't have that. Or do the small and medium have a head start because they want to do things differently? And the question now, which follows from this for you, is democracy a public good and anybody can come in? Because we are talking about, has it got to be tested every 5 years or every 7 years? Is it a public good?
Well, first of all, let me thank the Armenian government and foundation for the invitation. As the son and grandson of the Armenian diaspora as a result of the genocide, it's very moving to be here in Yerevan today for this and for the challenges that a country like Armenia faces going forward. I'm also sort of uncertain why I'm on this panel because I'm Mexican. I was a Mexican diplomat for 23 years. I now live in the US, and neither Mexico or the US are small and medium democracies. And in fact, both of them, for different reasons, are against the ropes. The constitutional reform that was approved early this morning in Mexico City will degrade Mexican democracy in ways that we have not seen. And I don't have to tell you about what's going in the US, contrary to the famous mantra of Las Vegas, when it comes to democracy and international democracy. What happens in Las Vegas doesn't stay in Las Vegas. And this has a very important impact for this discussion. I do think democracy is a global public good. I think nations should treat it as a global public good. I think those countries that have commonalities in terms of building a rules-based international order, I know that's a loaded term because many associate it directly with the US and the geopolitical West defining the rules of that international order after the Second World War and then after the end of the Cold War. But I think there is such a thing as a rules-based international system. I think small, medium-sized democracies can be very nimble in that type of engagement. More importantly, for small and medium-sized democracies, multilateralism, whether it's through formal multilateral foreign organizations, regardless of how much they have been degraded and are being questioned, whether it's through ad hoc coalition of the willing, sub-regional, regional, multilateral, plurilateral engagement. I think that for democracies that are small and medium, when you look at their ability to engage internationally with big powers, but also amongst themselves, there are two ways to go around the world. You either sit at the table or you're on the menu. And that is a very, I think, important trigger for how small, medium-sized democracies engage with one another. And I'll give you, I think, a very powerful example. You mentioned that this had been a tsunami year of electoral processes in the world. How small and medium-sized democracies engage with one another in electoral organization, electoral rules, building those countries that have national electoral authorities, how they cooperate in exchanging best practices. And the mantra that I think should be at the head of any engagement by small and medium-sized democracies when it comes to global issues, international affairs, is that you cooperate globally to solve regionally or locally. You tropicalize standard practices to be able to address specific issues that a collective group of nations are facing in a specific region of the world.
But what if you don't want to sit at the table? I saw your eyes go up. Manjiri, did you want to come in about models and funding of democratic, funding the democratic processes, and funding, election funding? And does it have to come from these big models?
Great, thank you. And thanks also to ORF and the Armenian MFA for this invite. I'm honored to sit here with all the political tycoons. I'm a healthcare practitioner. I was just joking with some of the panelists that I'm here to represent the Gen Zs from the African continent. I'm a millennial myself. I think one thing I wanted to bring out about financing and financing for elections, we were just talking about it recently, you would see how the Americans finance internally as a country. So if you're Kamala Harris, you're Trump, you have your people in the country fundraising for you to be able to run an election. We've seen very different concepts in Africa where a huge amount of the financing for your election, your campaigns, is probably coming externally. And that comes with its own caveats, it comes with its own carrots, it comes with own conditionalities. And I think that is one of the things that we are recognizing even as Kenyans. A good example is we just had a very heated youth-led protest for 2 months, July, August. That also made us to cancel Nairobi Dialogue, which was being organized by ORF. And one of the key things is that we felt that the government of the day is not people-driven. It's driven by external factors, for example, IMF and the World Bank. And those IMF and World Bank work for certain political offices, right? And some of the things that we are agitating for is just basically accountability. You know, we have finances in the country, why can't we, you know, use them for the right reasons and not be able to divert funds to people for things that are not people-driven within the country. So we find ourselves selling our countries to external forces. And I even wanted to start with a question. So for example, and just to make it politically correct for everyone, who has read or believes that, you know, Rwanda is an authoritarian, there's an authoritarian leader in Rwanda? Who has read or believes? Maybe just to see some hands up. Not necessarily believe, maybe read, just to be politically correct.
If it's authoritarian, would people feel comfortable raising their hands?
No. I think we've read so much that Rwanda is not a democratic country, that there's an authoritarian leader. Of course, he's been in power for the last maybe 4 or 5 terms. He's running his 4th term now. And with his 4th term, he won the elections with 99% of the votes. So, you know, there's certain journalists or certain media personalities or certain countries, certain people who think he's an authoritarian. But if you're winning an election with 99% votes, isn't that a democracy by its own right? Those people voted for you. Something else to just solidify that point is because you look at Rwanda, it's the only African country that everyone can access health with a social health insurance fund that costs you only $2 a year. Everyone can access education. 99% of children are enrolled in education. If you look at Rwanda, it's the only country in the world where we have 66% of parliamentarians being women. And of course, many other leaders having cabinet positions. And where I'm coming from in Kenya, where I think everyone or a lot of media reports read that we are democracy, I wouldn't necessarily say we are democracy given what we saw the last 2 months in July and August.
So the ground rules are we're not naming and shaming any, can you hear me? Not naming and shaming any countries, but 99% the 4th term has issues. But having said that, you had a point about election funding?
I just wanted to respond regarding the question of... Yeah, is it okay? Yeah. Just wanted to respond regarding 2 things. One is the question if the democracy is a public good, and the other one about the financing the democracy. If it's a public good, then we have an obligation to invest in democracy. Right now, there is a study that's published every year by the Institute of, it's called Varieties of Democracy. Today, 72% of world's population lives in one or other kind of autocracy, 72%. So if we want to invest in democracy, if we want the democracy to be public good, we really, and that's really the most important point, we need to invest in it. I'll give you one example, and it's an example that's perhaps also close to Armenia, because you just entered the International Criminal Court this year, you joined the Rome Statute. Working in The Hague for many years, I would say it's one of the institutions that is, you know, that guarantees the implementation of democracy when it comes to the criminal offenses around the world and to make the to guarantee justice. What is the, and I would ask you, what is the yearly budget of the International Criminal Courts, the criminal courts we have? It's 160 $60 million US dollars, 160 million US dollars. In comparison, Slovenia is a very small country with agriculture is not a big thing. Our Ministry for Agriculture has a budget that is twice as big as the ICC budget. So are we being serious about investing in democracy? I would argue definitely no.
Yeah, thank you. So just to add that on if democracy is a public good, it is. And why it is important to have a constant funding for democracy, because the criteria what is democracy and what is not are always changing, and it's like an infinity. You are not able to catch up, and you need to have a constant reform process, which means it requires big fundings to do it. But besides democracy being public good domestically, but some, internationally as well, democracy is also concern for the others. And some people, some authoritarian regimes consider it to be a threat, which means we should fund, because they don't want their own people to dare that they can live in the same freedom as the people in democracies. And combining this two brings to the idea that we should fund the democracies not only because of a public good, but also to protect the democracies, because it's also quite costly to protect the democracies.
When you said it's difficult to catch up, in the public good catch up, and with what?
One of the criteria for democracy is probably the center of a democracy is a person, an individual. And when person is living in a freedom, which means he is free to think, and free to dare, and free to dream, which means that the horizon is getting bigger and bigger, and the ambition of development and the scale of the development is becoming bigger and bigger, which puts additional pressure on the governments to work more and more and to invest more on reforms.
So what does democracy mean to China?
Well, the Communist Party in China says they are running a people's democracy. But I think we should have the basics right. When we discuss about democracy, the political science definition is participation in the decision-making processes by people. So in the case of China, when you look at dissect the decision-making process, you have 98 million cadres of the Communist Party elect the leadership, Politburo, Standing Committee, and Central Committee. So they represent the people's democracy, in other words. But when we look at the programs that they have, for example, in the 19th Communist Party Congress in 2017, they said that they want to export the China model, and China model basically being an authoritarian model. You have also in the external domain, the party-state model is being exported to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative projects, through various other Beijing consensus, as they say. But when we also look at the actual participation of the people, in China there are about 800,000 villages, and they generally have free and fair elections. But the catch is that the Communist Party is not located at the villages. It is located at the county level. It's located at the province level. It's located at the central Beijing level. So it doesn't really mean what's happening, the churning out process that is happening. But I must say, since I observed the village elections in China, I must agree that there is also the moneyed classes which are becoming the village presidents and members of the council which run the village councils. So there is also the money influence that is quite prevalent. And this is also prevalent at the election of the Communist Party cadres at the provincial level, prefecture level, and the central level. So there is the finance related that is happening. So I would say that it is an authoritarian model. We should be clear, and I'm wondering why and how democratic countries or representatives elected China to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and we are all responsible for this. How can China or other authoritarian regimes, look at Human Rights Council? What has happened? What is wrong with that? Yeah.
Made that point because to make the point that the multilateral system is broken. I mean, the UN system is broken, which is why we're having a discussion here that the UN doesn't represent its basic principles. But Judy, yeah.
Can I do a very quick two-finger on the issue of
Sure.
broken multilateralism? I always, as a bilateralist in the foreign ministry, I always criticize my colleagues in the foreign ministry who are in multilateral venues because I said you don't know how to operate the political relations between nations. But we also have to be careful when we criticize multilateralism because the nations themselves have been responsible for the breakdown of multilateralism. Yeah. And I'll use the Ukraine example. How many countries, and I'll speak to Latin America, how many countries have upheld the international conventions and the rule of law and the UN Convention, and it seems, if you look at how they position themselves on international aggression and the invasion of a sovereign, independent nation like Ukraine, today there are two countries in Latin America that have unequivocally condemned Russian aggression. Chile on the left, Uruguay on the right. All the others seem to suggest that intervention is wrong when it's US-led, but when it's somebody else, everyone plays possum. So part of that breakdown is how some of these small, medium-sized democracies, some of them are bigger, have positioned themselves on critical issues that are impacting the fluidity of the geopolitical system today.
Thank you. Judy, just to change a bit, but the second round will be on multilateralism, but COVID showed us that public health is also, it became like a weapon. Access to, and countries are using access to medicines as a weapon during COVID. And you have written about this, so tell us about it. Did it come to the high table with defense and military spending? Is public health now becoming a big spending? And where is that money going to come from? The minister just said people are more ambitious, they want more and more things. Is that a challenge now? Good public health.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And I like that idea of the horizon. You know, we need to demand more from our politicians. Looking back at, the lessons learned from COVID, I think none of it has been implemented. None of the recommendations, if you ask me, more than 90% has been implemented. Because if you look at, for example, public health spending on healthcare in Africa, we have maybe less than 5 countries that are spending 5% of their public health spending on healthcare. None of them has agreed to increase their spending on healthcare. They don't care about the plight of the healthcare workers. They don't care the plight, the quality of the healthcare commodities in the country. And we look at, well-wishers and very progressive companies like BioNTech. They wanted to set up facilities and manufacturing in Africa just because of what we experienced before with vaccine inequity. The Global South was deprioritized. The Global North was producing all the vaccines, and they had to serve themselves first before they could share the rest with the Global South. And of course, as usual, the global south had to cooperate amongst themselves. So most of our vaccines were coming from India and other parts of Asia. But truly and sadly, none of our governments have, learned from the lessons in the past. We don't want to crucify the global north. Of course, they take care of themselves first. But politicians and leaders in our continents need to think about their people first. And so if you're not investing in your healthcare, you're waiting for donations, you're waiting for grants and funds coming from the global north. I think the lessons have taught us that they will take care of themselves first, and then they'll look up to what your needs are. So BioNTech has been trying to set up in different countries, and the only country they succeeded without so much bureaucracy, again, I have to say, was Rwanda. So they're currently setting up a vaccine manufacturing, and all the other countries bring in their corruption and their bureaucracy when it comes to some of these advances in terms of looking at, because again, we are as strong as our weakest link. So they do recognize that we need to set up systems that work for Africa so that the world is winning as a whole. So I don't think we've progressed so much. I'm speaking, of course, for Africa.
It's off. Now it's on? It's on. It's on? It's on? Okay, I did want to say, we have a second round of questions. I just want to focus on, okay, my mic is not working. You put it off. No. No.
Small democracies are helping
Big democracies. Now, see, the other thing fell off. No, thank you for that. Okay, so you see that the trick to it. I have one more round of questions to do, and that will have to be, it's a bit provocative. If the UN did not exist, it would have to be recreated. And what role would small and medium democracies play in creating this? Because we know how it was created, winners of the war and all that. But should the opportunity be opened up to small and medium democracies, where would you begin? And this is an open question to all. And I think we're doing fine for time. We can, after this panel, distinguished panel, I'll go through everybody. We also have time for questions. So anybody wants to take that? Yes. Andrew and then the minister.
Thank you, Chitra. I also want to react to what was said. I mean, the Deputy Minister had a very interesting point on why democracies are attacked. And sometimes there are real sort of territorial disputes. Other times, like Ukraine, actually we look for reasons that are not rooted in reality. So a very popular explanation in parts of the world is that NATO expansion provoked Russia. We know that's not true. Historically, that's not what happened. Most Ukrainians did not want to join NATO, not even after Crimea was annexed by Russia. Ukrainians now, I think 90% want to join NATO because the state won't survive. Same for Sweden and Finland. So if we look for an explanation rooted in reality, it's the normative threat that democracy poses to autocracies that provokes them, actually. There was no problem between Ukraine and Russia while Ukraine was a hybrid democracy, while Moscow could control the Ukrainian government. So that's something in the West, I think, is very easily forgotten. The idea is that, democracies in general are peace-loving, engage in dialogue to resolve disputes, and don't generally understand that the very existence poses a threat to autocracies. The very existence is a provocation. And so why should democracies collaborate? I mean, that's the number one reason out of self-defense. And we know there's sort of regime complementarity, sort of similar regimes like to do things with each other, which is fine. And for a while autocracies were not actually very powerful geopolitically, that worked well. We had autocracies clubbing together, forming alliances. It didn't affect the democratic world. Now it does. The balance of power has shifted. as the State Secretary mentioned, the majority of people live in non-democratic countries. And so democracy is mortal and could actually become extinct both due to domestic factors and external ones. And again, just to touch on the Rwanda example, because I find it really interesting. So to win an election with 99% of the vote, obviously, you know, I wonder what result the next election will bring, no? Because there's only 1% left of the electorate. But the economic factors we've seen also in older democracies are almost as important as the political factors, that a democracy will collapse if there's too much economic inequality. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have
I
the
leave the
minister.
UN question.
Or inefficiency.
Wait, we have the minister, then the state, then the gentleman, and then you.
Thank you. Probably I will share the opinion that why small and medium democracies should cooperate, because they are the #1 beneficiaries of the international law to be properly operating and working. And coming to the comment that was made by Ambassador he said very interesting thing that some countries did abstain on a critical issue of Ukraine. But here is a question: what is the critical issue? Is it critical because it is Ukraine, or is it critical because the international law was violated? And unfortunately, we see that in, let's say, smaller cases, nobody is talking about that, you know, the international law is violated, UN Security Council is failing to address the issue. So here is another reason why the small and medium democracies should think about the future, the common future that we have. Unfortunately, hearing also the discussion that I'm part of now, and I'm sharing the guilt as well, I have a fear that we will not be able to unite.
Why?
Because we are talking, but we are not listening to each other. And sometimes even we are forgetting to self-reflect on the issues that we have on our cooperation, and we are talking about the third countries, the authoritarian regimes, and we are losing too much time and wasting too much time on thinking about the others rather than concentrating on the issue how we should work together.
Talking without listening. This is what Simon and Garfunkel sang.
Yes.
So?
Just a short comment on winning the elections with 99%. I'm not so old, but I was born in a country where the last elections were won by 105% in Yugoslavia. but still, the countries that emerged from Yugoslavia are now democratic countries. On your question about the role of small and medium-sized democracies, if the UN were not wasn't there, yeah, I would say that such countries would probably tend to, if there would be real democracy, would tend to establish a regional multilateral organizations. What happened in Europe? So Europe, we don't have big countries in Europe, right? I mean, it's Germany and France. It's still a mid-sized country, if we are fair. We did establish the European Union, and this is something I'm stressing all the time, that even if we are living in an area where we are saying that the multilateralism is in decline, that's even dead, it's not true entirely. Regional multilateral organizations, some of them are working and are successful. Also, global international organizations, like, for example, I was working for a long time at the OPCW, it's Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons. OPCW succeeded to destroy all the officially published amounts of chemical weapons all around the world. So you have success stories. Just to finish, what is the role of small and medium-sized countries if we have the UN? Slovenia results out of it, except walking out of the room a little bit more smarter, perhaps. But our role is to bring this discussion on the highest possible level and keep repeating it.
So you had a point?
Two very brief comments, both on your question of what would happen if there wasn't a UN and how small or medium-sized countries would react to that. I think you sort of mentioned this. You would see much more regionalization. I think you'd see the creation of multilateral, sub-regional, regional organizations, which are more nimble, which reflect, with differences, a sort of consensus on specific issues, or you see them as coalitions of the willing related to specific topics: climate change, immigration flows, trade and development, public health. So it would be I think it would be a very different architecture. It would probably be more nimble, and that's where I think small, medium-sized democracies can play a very important role. On the issue of democracy and democratic resilience, and sort of crossing that with your issues regarding public health and what you see in a place like Rwanda, for me, I think one of the most telling lessons of the pandemic was that at the end of the day, the basic cleavage, if you looked at the globe, wasn't between governments of the left and governments of the right. It wasn't between authoritarian states and liberal democracies. It was between efficient and non-efficient governments, governments that could deal effectively with public health responses to, you know, how to confront this, with countries that were a mess. And that also tells you a bit as to sort of this whole issue of democratic resilience and democratic strength, because at the end of the day, if that conveyor belt between the democratic process and citizens is broken, as it is in many countries around the world that are democracies to one or lesser extent, that's going to add greater pressures to not only the democratic fiber of a specific nation, but also how some of these governments are engaging with one another in addressing global challenges, like, for example, how do you deal with the next pandemic?
So we've done the rounds here. We open up for questions. Please identify, one second. Please identify yourself, say who you are, and don't make a speech. Ask a question. I see a hand.
I'm from. It's up, so I hope it's now on. It's, yeah. So I'm Krzyzewski from Warsaw-based think tank. I'm from Poland. And, you know, as you know, we were backsliding on democracy, and maybe now we are upsliding on democracy. You know, we have a very vibrant past as well. But what keeps our democracy vibrant are media. And this, what gives the democracy a real life is the transparency and the accountability which the media give. So my question is, we have also maybe helped some countries and in the region here with our initiative, European Endowment for Democracy. And my question is, don't you think it would be quite useful to have a global endowment for democracy, particularly helping media in smaller and bigger states to be independent and to provide quality information? Thank you.
Global endowment?
Global endowment for democracy, and with the specific goal of supporting media in this accountability and transparency process.
Anyone to take the... So you and the three of you there. The lady first.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it also resonates with something that I wanted to speak ahead. There's a saying in Africa that says, until the lion learns how to write, the hunter will always be glorified. And it speaks to what he's saying. A lot of the news, a lot of what it comes out from media, especially from the global north, is perhaps constructed or paid media. Yeah, it doesn't paint the best limelight for certain geographies. And of course, it has a business connotation, it has a trade connotation, it has self-interest connotations. And just to emphasize what I was saying, yes, maybe there was an election won with 99%, But then there's many other things that demonstrate that that particular political leader is winning for his people. Whatever reforms he's making in his country, whatever political interest that he has are people driven from that particular country. So I think for sure we need to listen to the stories as they come from their own countries and perhaps not always listen to international well-endowed media houses, but also the small stories that are coming from the countries at the grassroots level, because that's where the story is. And I want to emphasize, until the lion can write, the hunter will always be glorified.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you, Chitra. I'm really happy with that question because there is a global media freedom fund operated by UNESCO, but it's very small. It's minuscule compared to the scale of what's needed. And obviously it needs to focus on direct threats to journalists. But another side of the coin is the business model of media. I mean, in Poland, the state broadcaster was actually subordinated under the political party of the time. So it's really sort of independent outlets that managed to survive somehow, maybe because Poland was part of the European Union. In other countries, what would have happened is that if you have press freedom with democratic backsliding, often journalists come under grave threat. So in those conditions, the journalists are attacked and they lose. Inevitably. So the media freedom and rule of law need to be strengthened at the same time. Otherwise, what we'll see is the risk to journalists increasing dramatically. Now, the question of sort of who should govern a fund like this, if you have national level funds for media, it's obviously problematic because those could very quickly come under political control. But there are models that are effective. And I think the best models of independent public broadcasters should be used to help fund independent media as well, because we simply haven't found a solution to create a sustainable business model for media in the age of social media. A global fund would obviously mean that the money is politically independent, but that requires a bit of a bureaucracy.
So, next you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to say that the issue of how you defend and bolster a free press and a press that is checking and countering disinformation, which is probably the greatest challenge that we see in media ecosystems in big, small, and medium-sized democracies around the world, is the rule of law. Because, and again, so we don't shame and name anyone here, I'll name and shame my own country. Mexico saw a record number of journalists killed in this electoral cycle that we've just gone through. 34 journalists killed just this year. So it's about press freedom, but it's also in countries like mine, others, how do you protect the press? Again, there are important models of NGOs that are doing, I think, stellar work. Article 19 and the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. And that's where I think what we should try and foster as countries that are interested in this agenda is media-to-media engagement. That is a consortium of international outlets that collaborate horizontally to elevate standards, to ensure that there's a mechanism of fact-checking against disinformation, or mechanisms that allow journalists to be protected by that type of horizontal engagement and collaboration. And so this is, and I agree, sort of the media and the media ecosystem. When I was ambassador, I would joke that diplomats and flies have one thing in common, that we both get killed by a newspaper. Substitute diplomats for politicians, and the relevance of why the media plays such an important role in this issue is evident.
I just wanted to mention my own example. I have co-founded a, this is not to talk about my own news organization, but it's called the News Minute in South India. That is not important. What is important is that we had difficulty in finding funding. We don't take any political funding, no funding from anyone. And our model is subscriber-based. It's taken time, but that's what is happening. People are collaborating, new types of collaboration. If a story is too big, you share. You share your resources, you share your journalists. And social media has come in as a big big help, as in nothing can be hidden today, which in itself is a huge help. So yes, collaboration and making sure that the news gets out. I saw another, yeah, sir, go ahead. There are two hands. Madam, the gentleman at the back had it first, so yeah. After that, madam.
Good afternoon. I'm Achal Malhotra from India, former Indian ambassador to Armenia and Georgia. Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for sharing your views articulated with clarity and conviction. I have a very small observation and a question to ask. Well, I think it's very difficult to disagree that despite pitfalls and deficiencies, democracy is the most acceptable model of governance. Having said that, would you agree that the urge for democracy as a model of governance should come from within the country, and the export of democracy as an ideology with vested interest must be checked and prevented? Also, external funding to put in place a government of your choice by the big powers in smaller countries has to be stopped. Would you agree with these views, and what can be done to prevent this phenomenon? Thank you very much.
Urge to be democratic has to be national. Let's stick with that, I mean, yeah.
I would fully subscribe that part. I would also sort of subscribe the second part, which is I don't think the export of democracy should be a foreign policy priority, but I do think that the defense of democracy needs to be a foreign policy priority.
You had, yes, sir.
Perhaps just shortly in this question. What is democracy? Democracy is the trust of a ruling class to its own people, right? I would argue that all the citizens in all the countries would want to have a democracy as a system in their own country. But then I guess we come back to the question that we had before about media independence and how to control the public opinions, how to manipulate the public opinions, how to misuse the mechanisms that the ruling class has with controlling the media. And of course the answer to the question of the gentleman is yes, but the challenge is to get this will of the people to be represented at the national level. The challenges are sometimes very, very hard.
Thank you. Did you have Andrew?
Sure, happy to come in. I mean, the World Economic Forum is an impartial organization, so I think you're trying to get me fired, Chitra. But I find that question very provocative because the world is interconnected. So let's take an example I can talk about, Russia. Europe was essentially funding the Russian regime through its consumption of hydrocarbons. If then on the other hand you say that Europe should stay out of the consequences of all that cash going to the Kremlin, I find that suspect as a way of reasoning, because actually European consumption financed that economic model, which is incompatible in most cases, the only exception is Norway maybe, with democracy. So I think that countries, Latin America is a case in point. All the drugs, the massive market to the north for drugs, look at the consequences it has in several economies in Central and Latin America. Look at the impact on their democracies. So then to turn around and say, actually, the United States shouldn't deal with those consequences, shouldn't contribute where it can to the rule of law, to strengthen institutions, I think is an argument, is a sort of self-interested argument. And yes, it would be ideal if everyone sort of stayed in their lane, if autocracy stayed in their lane, if democracy stayed in their lane, but the reality is that they engage, they interact, and need to deal with the consequences of that interaction. Maybe, so as not to sound like an idealist, I would say that there are some countries which are constructive internationally, even if they're not democracies. And I think in those cases, democracies should engage with them without necessarily interfering in their own domestic processes, because they play a constructive role in the world. Maybe that's where I would draw the line.
We've really run out of time, so we have to, ma'am, I'm sorry, we'll have to close the debate. Thank you, everyone. Since Andrew mentioned that I live in Europe, I'm Indian, and I have a view on the European Union. I do want to say that my husband's European, and I follow Europe very closely. But having said that, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And I think we're going to coffee now, so we can continue discussion at coffee time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll have a 20-minute coffee break, and we'll see you back in this room in 20.